imposing retaliatory tariffs right now on the United States, hitting billions of dollars worth of goods and energy resources.
Or even a bipolar conflict between China and the United States.
What if I told you the dollar, yes, the very foundation of American global power, is under attack like never before? And it's not just rumors. As China leads the BRICS alliance in an all-out financial offensive, sanctions and gold hoarding are sending shockwaves through Wall Street. The numbers are terrifying. Over $800 billion wiped out in US market value. Tesla is crumbling. Trade alliances are imploding. Even Trump is threatening 100% tariffs out of desperation. Could this be the collapse no one saw coming? Or is it a master plan decades in the making? Cracks in the fortress of the dollar. For decades, the US dollar has stood as the indestructible pillar of global finance. It backed world trade, dictated economic strategy,
with currency being the backbone of their economic strength,
and gave America unmatched geopolitical dominance. But in early 2025, that dominance began to show serious cracks. China, the world's second largest economy, made a bold move, one that caught even seasoned economists off guard. In a matter of months, China offloaded massive amounts of US Treasury bonds and aggressively increased its gold reserves. The message was clear: the age of dollar supremacy might be coming to an end. What startled financial analysts the most wasn't just the speed of China's pivot, but the timing. Just as Donald Trump returned to power with renewed economic aggression, imposing steep tariffs and reigniting trade wars, BRICS nations, led by China, launched a coordinated response. Russia, India, Brazil, and South Africa joined the chorus, signaling support for a new financial structure, one not built on the US dollar, but on gold, bilateral trade agreements, and digital currencies. Suddenly, America's monopoly over global transactions was under siege from all sides. These moves weren't symbolic, they were surgical. In late January, China's central bank reported a 250-ton increase in its gold reserves. Simultaneously, the country slashed its holdings of US bonds to historic lows. This wasn't just financial diversification, it was a calculated strike. By reducing its dependency on US debt, China insulated itself from American sanctions, while positioning the yuan, and eventually a gold-backed currency, as a legitimate alternative to the dollar. And the BRICS nations followed suit. Wall Street felt the tremors almost immediately. The dollar, once considered untouchable, began slipping in value against key currencies. Investors, once blindly loyal to the greenback, started hedging their bets with gold and alternative assets. A financial storm was brewing. Stocks began to shake. Big tech took a hit, but it was Tesla that suffered the most dramatic collapse, an early indicator that US corporate giants were vulnerable in this new global order. Behind the scenes, Washington was panicking. Treasury officials scrambled to reassure allies, but confidence was waning. The IMF and World Bank started receiving quiet inquiries from developing nations asking about alternatives to the dollar-based system.
It was the United States' ability to print endless supply of US dollars.
Countries that had once relied on American financial stability were now exploring Chinese lending programs, Russian trade corridors, and gold-backed digital transactions. The ripples were spreading faster than anyone had predicted. And then came Trump's retaliation. In a fiery press conference, he threatened a 100% tariff on any BRICS nation that dared conduct international trade without using the US dollar. It was a desperate move, but one that revealed just how threatened America truly felt. Economists called it a gamble that could backfire catastrophically. After all, if the world no longer trusts the dollar, tariffs won't bring back dominance. They'll only accelerate the decline. Could this be the beginning of the end for America's financial empire? Or is this the chaos that gives birth to a new system entirely? Because the next chapter reveals the terrifying ripple effects already shaking Wall Street and the corporate casualties piling up faster than anyone expected. Wall Street in freefall. Tesla takes the first hit. It began with whispers, investors quietly pulling out of high-risk tech stocks, hedge funds making sudden, unexplained moves into precious metals. Then came the sharp thud. Tesla, one of the crown jewels of American innovation, lost over $800 billion in market capitalization. In less than 6 months, the electric car pioneer had gone from Wall Street darling to cautionary tale, and the dominoes had just started falling. Tesla's stock plummeted over 15% in a single trading day, followed by another 3% after hours. This wasn't the result of a product failure or an executive scandal. This was different. Analysts began connecting the dots. Tariffs on Chinese goods had made imported parts more expensive. The Chinese government had raised EV taxes on foreign brands, and China's own homegrown companies, like BYD, were flooding the market with cheaper, equally advanced alternatives. Elon Musk's empire wasn't collapsing due to competition. It was being squeezed out by geopolitics. China's retaliatory tariff increase from 15% to 25% on high-end Tesla models was a strategic attack. These were the models that once commanded attention: the Model S, Model X, and the performance versions of the Model 3. With those price tags now inflated beyond reason in the Chinese market, Tesla's appeal in the world's largest EV market evaporated almost overnight. Consumers turned to BYD and NIO, brands offering similar features at a fraction of the cost. In 2023, BYD sold over 1.2 million vehicles in China. Tesla, barely 350,000. As China's appetite for Tesla waned, European markets weren't any kinder. In fact, things were worse. A 30% sales drop across key EU countries was coupled with growing consumer resentment toward Musk's politics and the US's aggressive foreign trade tactics. Musk's once celebrated public persona, an eccentric genius, had become polarizing. His growing ties to the Trump administration, public outbursts, and controversial statements alienated liberal markets abroad and even eroded domestic loyalty in the United States. The real terror for investors, though, wasn't just Tesla's bleeding market share. It was what Tesla represented. The company was a barometer for tech-driven optimism, a beacon of future forward wealth. If Tesla could be shaken so deeply by geopolitical tremors, what about Apple, Google, Amazon? The sell-offs began quietly, but gained momentum quickly. Wall Street was no longer just reacting to market data. It was responding to a seismic geopolitical shift. The fall of Tesla didn't just rattle investors, it sent a chill through the US government. For years, economic dominance had been leveraged as a diplomatic weapon. Now, with BRICS creating a parallel system and nations de-dollarizing at record speed, Washington's weapons were starting to backfire.
That using the US dollar as a weapon by imposing financial and economic sanctions on other states,
China wasn't just competing with the US, it was now successfully redirecting global demand. Tesla was merely the first American giant to fall in this new economic battlefield. And what about the rest of Silicon Valley? Could the very foundations of America's tech dominance be next? Because in Chapter 3, we uncover how BRICS is strategically positioning itself to dismantle not just the dollar, but the very industries the US once used to control the world. BRICS Master Plan: a global economy without the dollar. As Tesla trembled and Wall Street braced for aftershocks, a much bigger strategy began to unfold, one that had been brewing quietly for years, mostly dismissed by Western economists. But now, it was impossible to ignore. BRICS, an alliance once seen as an economic underdog, was starting to look more like the architect of a new world order, and its target, the very heart of American power, the US dollar. It began subtly. Small bilateral agreements between China and Russia to trade in their own currencies. Brazil quietly moving its soybean exports to yuan-based transactions. India expanding its oil deals with Russia using rupees instead of dollars. One by one, countries began sidestepping the dollar. The momentum was slow at first, but it was steady. And now, in early 2025, it has reached critical mass. For the first time in nearly a century, the dominance of the US dollar is no longer a guarantee. At the center of this financial rebellion is China. In just 12 months, Beijing slashed its US Treasury holdings by over $100 billion. That money didn't just vanish, it was converted into 250 tons of gold added to China's already massive reserves. This wasn't just diversification, it was economic warfare. Gold doesn't depend on American policy. It doesn't bend under sanctions.
Economies known as BRICS makes up more than 40% of the world's population and a quarter of the global economy.
And it's rapidly becoming the new language of global trade. BRICS, now expanded to include Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Iran, is laying the groundwork for a currency of its own, one backed not by political promises, but by tangible assets like gold, rare earth metals, and oil. Their endgame is no longer speculation, it's declaration. A new reserve currency, outside the influence of Washington, the Federal Reserve, and Wall Street. One that countries across Africa, South America, and Asia are already beginning to trust more than the once unshakable US dollar. The consequences for America are staggering. If global demand for the dollar evaporates, so does its ability to borrow cheaply. Interest rates will soar, inflation will run wild, and every imported product will become significantly more expensive. Even worse, the vast reserves of dollars held abroad will start flooding back into the US market, triggering what some economists are now calling the potential dollar collapse spiral. In the past, US sanctions were effective because the dollar was indispensable. That era is ending. BRICS countries are now building parallel banking systems, alternative SWIFT replacements, and trade networks that bypass traditional Western institutions entirely. In short, the US isn't just being challenged, it's being cut out. And for Americans already struggling with inflation, job insecurity, and dwindling savings, the de-dollarization movement isn't just foreign policy, it's personal. This shift could mean higher mortgage rates, more expensive groceries, and a stock market that feels increasingly like a rigged casino. Yet while the media debates Trump's tariffs and Tesla's bleeding stock, few are asking the question that truly matters. What happens when the US dollar is no longer the world's safe haven, but just another currency among many? The collapse begins. Main Street feels the blow. While Wall Street analysts scramble to make sense of the BRICS offensive, the fallout has already started hitting average Americans in the face. At first, it was subtle. Your morning coffee a little pricier, your gas tank a bit more expensive to fill. But now, the full impact of de-dollarization is making its way to the core of American life. And it's not just numbers on a chart anymore. It's jobs, mortgages, and entire livelihoods on the brink. The first sign came in the form of interest rate hikes. As BRICS nations began offloading US treasuries en masse, the bond market spiraled. That forced the Federal Reserve's hand. Suddenly, borrowing costs soared. Mortgage applications dropped to historic lows. Businesses halted expansions, and car loans became unaffordable for the average American family. Real estate, once the symbol of financial freedom, is now turning into a graveyard of for sale signs and foreclosure notices. Then came the supply chain crisis. With the dollar losing its grip on international trade, importers found themselves locked out of previous deals. Prices for everything from electronics to medicine surged as foreign suppliers demanded payment in more stable or local currencies. Shelves started to thin out. American companies reliant on global manufacturing, tech firms, auto giants, pharmaceutical producers, began slashing jobs, first in the hundreds, then in the thousands. Meanwhile, grocery bills have ballooned. Imported staples like coffee, rice, and fruits have seen double-digit price hikes. Even domestically grown produce has become more expensive as transportation costs, tied to global oil prices and a weakening dollar, skyrocketed. For the average household, budgets are collapsing, savings are drying up, and paycheck-to-paycheck living has become the new national norm. In Washington, panic is starting to show. Lawmakers are divided, with some calling for emergency currency stabilization acts, while others urge immediate military or trade retaliation against BRICS members.
Russian authorities are keen to promote the idea of a unified BRICS financial system to rival the dominant US dollar.
But the truth is, America was warned. Economists flagged the dangers of global de-dollarization years ago, warnings that were dismissed as fear-mongering. Now they look more like prophecies. And as Trump doubles down on tariffs and threats, especially against China, markets respond not with confidence, but with fear. The Dow plunges, the Nasdaq bleeds. Companies once seen as unstoppable, like Apple, Microsoft, and Tesla, are now scrambling to pivot. But in a world where US influence is fading, even the giants aren't safe anymore. For years, America's economic dominance was built on the illusion that the dollar was forever. That illusion is cracking, and the shockwaves are shaking the very foundations of the US economy. China's silent coup, the takeover you never saw coming. While America is caught in the whirlwind of economic panic, Beijing is playing a longer, colder, and more calculated game. As US markets sink and inflation rages, China's strategy is unfolding like a master chess move. Silent, precise, and devastating. The BRICS alliance isn't just about ditching the dollar, it's about shifting global power in a way that most Americans never expected, and few are prepared for. The core of China's plan lies in two things: gold and influence. While the US prints money and juggles debt ceilings, China has been stacking gold bars like bricks, quietly and aggressively. With over 1,600 tons added to its reserves in just 3 years, China now holds one of the largest sovereign stockpiles in the world. Why? Because gold doesn't need a central bank's permission. It doesn't depend on sanctions, and in times of crisis, it becomes the true global currency. But it doesn't stop there. China is aggressively replacing the dollar in global transactions through its cross-border interbank payment system, CIPS, a direct competitor to SWIFT. And now, more than 40 countries are either participating or in talks to join. Russia, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and even traditional US allies like South Africa and Argentina are exploring this parallel system. It's the financial equivalent of building a second internet.
The BRICS group is all about. It stands for Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa.
And America isn't invited. Backed by gold, state-owned banks, and bilateral trade agreements, China's yuan is gaining ground at lightning speed. In energy markets, oil once priced exclusively in dollars is now being sold in yuan, especially by BRICS allies like Russia and Iran. In Africa, the Belt and Road Initiative has locked dozens of countries into Chinese infrastructure projects, all financed and repaid in non-dollar currencies. The dollar isn't just being challenged, it's being replaced, one deal at a time. Even in tech and innovation, China is no longer the student, it's the rival. While US companies grapple with supply chain breakdowns and rising costs, China's EV and solar markets are exploding. BYD is outselling Tesla, Huawei is building entire smart cities abroad, and Chinese chipmakers, once reliant on Western suppliers, are now building homegrown fabs with massive state support. The West thought they had decades. China has caught up in less than 10 years. What's most alarming is that all of this is happening without a single bullet fired. No war, no invasion, just quiet deals, silent shifts, and strategic partnerships that slowly pull the world away from American dominance. While Washington plays checkers, Beijing is finishing the last moves of a global chess match. And as the US economy bleeds from within, the world is beginning to notice. In the halls of the IMF, at Davos, even in the boardrooms of Wall Street, there's a whisper growing louder every day. Maybe the future doesn't speak English. Maybe it speaks Mandarin. Wall Street meltdown, the collapse that caught America off guard. It didn't start with fireworks. It started with silence. A deafening silence from trading desks across Wall Street when the opening bell rang and blue-chip stocks began to nosedive. Not from scandal, not from war, but from something far more sinister, global rejection of the US dollar. And with China and BRICS nations pulling the plug, the financial dominoes in America began to fall one by one. Major investment firms, once bullish on US dominance, began dumping dollar-backed assets. Sovereign wealth funds in Asia, Africa, and the Middle East were rebalancing portfolios away from US treasuries and into gold, crypto, and commodities. For decades, the dollar was seen as the ultimate safe haven. Now, investors were calling it a sinking ship. As confidence evaporated, so did trillions in wealth. Banks were next. As liquidity dried up and dollar flows slowed internationally, US banks found themselves scrambling to stabilize. Credit markets tightened, lending froze, and interest rates, already sky-high from inflation control efforts, became economically toxic. Small businesses couldn't get loans. Mortgages stalled. Consumer spending collapsed. The real estate bubble that had been quietly swelling since the pandemic burst overnight. What stunned experts most wasn't the speed of the collapse, it was the source. This wasn't a housing crash. This wasn't a subprime disaster. This was a currency crisis. As the dollar lost its status as the world's fallback asset, Wall Street lost its backbone. Foreign investors pulled out of the stock market in record volumes. Companies that depended on international investment began announcing layoffs, restructuring plans, and worst of all, bankruptcy filings. The ripple effect was devastating. Tech giants started slashing R&D budgets. Venture capital dried up almost instantly. Startups in Silicon Valley saw funding disappear like a mirage. Even artificial intelligence and clean energy, once considered too big to fail, were suddenly on the chopping block. America's innovation engine was grinding to a halt, not because of a lack of ideas, but because the dollar was no longer trusted to back them. Panic quickly spread to average Americans. Retirement accounts were wiped out in weeks. The Dow dropped over 30%. Nasdaq cratered, and the housing market, already on edge, began to resemble the 2008 meltdown. Except this time, there was no bailout big enough to patch the leak, because this time the world wasn't just dealing with a banking collapse, it was turning its back on the currency that once ran the planet. But the real question wasn't how low the market would go, it was what would come after. Would the US build a new financial foundation? Or would it double down on the very system that led to this collapse? The White House civil war, desperation, division, and a nation on the brink. As the markets plummeted and international trust in the US dollar eroded, something darker began brewing within the walls of Washington, D.C. The financial chaos wasn't just shaking portfolios, it was splitting the political core of America in two. And at the center of the storm was Donald Trump, once again holding the reins but now presiding over a country buckling under global economic pressure. The cracks in leadership weren't subtle. Inside the West Wing, officials began leaking stories of shouting matches, resignations, and a frantic attempt to spin the narrative. Trump insisted the collapse was sabotage, the result of deep state operatives, democratic saboteurs, and even foreign agents planted inside US institutions. His solution? Total economic war. He demanded immediate 100% tariffs on all BRICS nations, a freeze on Chinese assets in the US, and threatened sanctions on allies who refused to back the dollar. But not everyone was on board. Key advisors, including some Republican allies, warned that these actions would worsen the crisis. Treasury officials argued that retaliating without leverage would only speed up the global shift away from US currency. Trump didn't listen. Instead, he turned to the growing force of Dark MAGA, a movement now expanding beyond internet forums and into mainstream protests, demanding economic revenge. Meanwhile, the American public was spiraling. Gas prices were soaring. Grocery store shelves were thin. Inflation hit double digits again, and the once assured promise of retirement for millions had been replaced by desperation. The White House, once the symbol of global power, now looked like a bunker. Trump began surrounding himself with loyalists, some with little political experience, but absolute loyalty. The decisions became erratic. Tensions with the Federal Reserve reached a boiling point. Trump accused Chairman Jerome Powell of treason for not cutting rates fast enough and floated replacing him with a political ally. When news leaked that high-ranking Pentagon officials were holding secret meetings to safeguard national stability, speculation swirled about the unthinkable. The military preparing to step in if Washington spun completely out of control. But the world wasn't waiting. BRICS nations accelerated their decoupling. The Chinese yuan, now partially backed by gold, was gaining adoption in South America and Africa. Russia and India launched a new blockchain-based settlement system, and European banks began hedging in currencies other than the dollar for the first time in decades. America was bleeding influence by the hour. Through all this, Americans took to the streets, not in celebration, in outrage. Some blamed China, others blamed Trump. Many didn't know who to blame anymore. But one thing was certain: confidence in leadership had collapsed, and the US government was now fighting battles on two fronts, abroad and within. The dark clouds over the dollar. As China, Russia, Brazil, India, and South Africa continue to deepen their economic cooperation under the BRICS alliance, a dark storm gathers over the United States dollar. For nearly a century, the greenback has stood as the world's reserve currency, giving America unmatched leverage in international trade, borrowing, and sanctions. But now, as BRICS pushes to settle trades in local currencies, or even gold-backed assets, that dominance is being directly threatened. The once unshakable foundation of US financial supremacy is beginning to show cracks, and the consequences are just beginning to unfold. The fear is no longer theoretical. Nations that once held large sums of US dollars as part of their foreign exchange reserves are now diversifying rapidly. China, for instance, has dumped tens of billions in US Treasury bonds over the past year, and instead is hoarding gold at an unprecedented rate. This is not a hedge, it's a shift. Brazil has begun executing trade deals with China in yuan. India is discussing settlement mechanisms with Russia in rupees, and South Africa is exploring digital currencies to avoid using the dollar altogether. The financial systems that once flowed through Wall Street are now slowly bypassing it. This isn't just a foreign policy problem. It's a domestic disaster waiting to explode. If the dollar loses its reserve status, the US would no longer be able to borrow cheaply. Interest rates would skyrocket. Inflation would surge. The ability to sanction rival nations effectively would vanish. And, perhaps most chillingly, the US would lose one of its most powerful tools of global influence: economic pressure. As BRICS becomes more cohesive, the dollar's weakening influence could spiral into full-blown economic chaos at home. The signs are already there. American credit ratings have been downgraded. Foreign central banks are reducing their exposure to US bonds. Even countries traditionally aligned with Washington are exploring alternative financial instruments. The petrodollar, once a cornerstone of dollar demand, is being questioned as oil giants like Saudi Arabia flirt with yuan-based deals. The world is moving on, and America is struggling to keep pace. Donald Trump's warning that a 100% tariff would be imposed on any BRICS nation abandoning the dollar may be more of a last-ditch threat than a viable strategy. The US can't strong-arm its way out of this. Tariffs will only accelerate the decline if they push countries to embrace alternative systems more aggressively. Trump's message may resonate with his voter base, but on the global stage, it's igniting urgency for countries to escape the dollar's grip for good. Meanwhile, US corporations are caught in the crossfire. With China raising tariffs on American products and reducing reliance on US imports, companies from Tesla to Apple are experiencing devastating losses. This isn't just a trade war anymore. It's an economic realignment. America's biggest brands are losing ground in markets they once dominated, and Wall Street is beginning to panic. If BRICS successfully launches a gold-backed currency or forms a legitimate alternative payment system, the shift could become permanent. It wouldn't just destabilize the dollar, it would redefine the global financial hierarchy. The US might find itself in a world where its dollar is no longer king, but just another currency among many. And if that day comes, it won't just be BRICS nations celebrating. It'll be the moment the world finally breaks free from a century of dollar dependency, and America may not be ready for what follows. But while the US scrambles to hold its ground, BRICS is preparing its final move, and the dollar might not survive what's coming next. A new world without the dollar. Behind closed doors, something seismic is taking shape. BRICS leaders have reportedly begun finalizing the blueprint for a gold-backed digital currency, one that could serve as the group's primary medium of exchange for global trade. If implemented, this would be the final blow to the US dollar's supremacy. Unlike traditional fiat currencies, this digital alternative would be backed by tangible assets like gold and rare earth metals, giving it a sense of legitimacy and security that many emerging economies crave. What once sounded like conspiracy is now inches from reality, and America is running out of options. Sources suggest that by early next year, pilot tests will begin between Russia, China, and Iran, using this BRICS currency to facilitate energy transactions. Brazil and South Africa are preparing to adopt similar measures for mineral and agricultural trade. These moves are deliberate, calculated, and executed with precision. And with each new contract signed in non-dollar terms, the US loses not just money, but influence. The Federal Reserve is watching with alarm. Quiet emergency meetings have reportedly taken place, with top economists warning the Treasury Department that
really, I think he's going to be a great Secretary of the Treasury,
that this shift could devalue the dollar globally and lead to a currency crisis on US soil. If international demand for dollars collapses, so too does the US government's ability to fund its ballooning debt. Treasury yields would surge, interest rates would spike, and Americans would pay the price through skyrocketing inflation and an economic contraction unlike any before. For the average citizen, this isn't just about geopolitics or financial jargon. It's about real pain. Mortgages becoming unaffordable, savings eroding overnight, and imports becoming luxuries. The US could face a new era of austerity, one where printing money no longer fixes everything. The country would be forced to live within its means, a jarring reversal for an empire built on boundless borrowing. Perhaps the most haunting detail is this: America saw it coming. Economists, analysts, and even former presidents warned that weaponizing the dollar would eventually backfire. Sanctions, tariffs, and financial bullying pushed nations to build alternatives. And now, those alternatives are not only here, they're stronger, smarter, and ready for global adoption. The question is no longer whether the US dollar will fall, it's when. And when it does, the world may never look the same again. The US dollar once reigned without question, a pillar of global finance and a symbol of American power. But today, as BRICS moves boldly to rewrite the rules of money, that dominance is crumbling. From China's gold stockpiles to Brazil's yuan deals and Russia's energy alliances, the world is changing faster than anyone anticipated. And if America doesn't adapt, it risks losing everything. What do you think? Can the US dollar survive this global rebellion, or are we witnessing the end of an era? Let us know in the comments. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe for more breaking insights into the world economy, and stay tuned for what BRICS does next. Trust us, it's only getting started.